Thank you for joining our church online. We encourage you to visit citylightla.church for our service times, location, and upcoming events. If you enjoy our videos and would like to give to lives being changed in Los Angeles, visit citylightla.church/give.
Surprise! Those of you guys that were expecting our pastor to preach this morning, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But him and his wife took a much-needed time to themselves. As you guys know very well, our pastor preaches extremely passionately and prepares extremely passionately. Not just to deliver the word every Sunday, but also pastor and care and nurture this flock and this group of individuals. And I encourage you to pray for him. I encourage you to text him and encourage him regularly. We have an incredible gift in our pastor, and I believe that he definitely deserves a time off. The guy works like no one I've ever known before. Honestly, he really intimidates me when it comes to his work ethic. But I'm really thankful that I get to be under his leadership, and we get to be a part of this church. And God has given him such a vision and such a passion for LA and for all of you. And I encourage you to pray for him and welcome him back and his wife when they return next week. He will be concluding the good life next week, and you don't want to miss it. It's going to be a great one. But this morning, I'm preaching. So, Pastor called me last week, and a little earlier than last week, and he said, "Hey, I want you to preach." And usually, when it comes to getting the chance to preach up here, I kind of have to really think deeply as far as what God would want me to speak on, but it's like in that moment, God gave me exactly what I needed to speak on. And it's a passage here that we find in Exodus chapter 20, a passage that came to me that I found several years ago in my own personal study that spoke to me on the issue that I'd like to share with you this morning. But the crazy thing about the Bible is that as years go by, you find that it has incredible depth the more and more you get into it. The more and more the years go by, the more and more these passages and these words begin to mean to you. Years ago, it meant one thing, and it was incredibly powerful for me personally, but now at this stage of my life, I believe it's meant so much more. And I hope that today you would walk out feeling that same way. That this word that I'm going to share with you this morning would mean something to you, so much so that you would walk out of here feeling like you have something to do, feeling you have something to change. But by way of introduction, I'd like to share just something personal that I'd like to use to help us understand what we're going to talk about today. And if you haven't experienced this incredible cinematic event, then I'm sorry, but you're missing out. If you're one of those that really hate these type of movies, then I feel a little sorry for you. But personally, I'm a huge MCU fan. I love the Marvel movies. Marvel movies are like incredible to me. They're like for me, they're the fulfillment of everything I've ever wanted as a kid. You know, like as a kid looking at the Spider-Man animated series and feeling like, man, here he is in real life and he's like perfect. This Tom Holland guy, but he's just awesome. And this Iron Man guy, look at Captain America go, like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. But when Avengers Endgame was announced, what many of us saw was that, I don't know if you felt this way, if you were someone who was anticipating this movie, but in anticipation for this movie, for me, I felt like they didn't give us much to work with. Last year, around December, I think, they came out with a little clip, a little trailer, and I remember thinking, that's it? That's all you're going to show us? You're kidding me. Like, that's all you're going to show us. And then they came out with one other one, I think, during the Super Bowl, and I thought, that's still nothing. But then they came out with another one. And in this one particular clip, you see Captain America, he's talking to all the Avengers, and they're talking about their plan of how they can defeat Thanos and whatever. And then he says this, he says, we'll do it, whatever it takes. And if you saw the movie, you know that the theme of the movie. That though they had an incredible failure that they just faced, that they just experienced, that they were going to do whatever it takes to reverse or at least heal the effects of that failure. And I'd like to share with you this morning that many times, though we may feel like failures, though many times we may fail in life, you're going to have to decide to either make excuses or do whatever it takes to follow and fulfill the call that God has placed on your life. See, which is why I share with you the title of my message this morning, No Excuses, Only Enlistment. No excuses, only enlistment. Tomorrow we celebrate Memorial Day, a day in which we honor those who have fallen, who gave their lives so passionately to make sure that we could enjoy the freedoms we enjoy here in this country. And if you know someone who has been part of that, or someone who is in the armed forces, or someone who gave their life, you knew that it began with enlisting. It began with a commitment. It began with a sign-up. And I'd like to encourage you with this, that you will live one of two lives, a life full of excuses or a life of enlistment. You can choose to decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to make every excuse in the book to make sure that I can get out of this situation or this thing that life is calling me to do. Or you can sign up and say, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to let anything get in the way. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And here in this passage, I find an incredible little conversation between Moses and his people. And right now, the context, if you know this passage, just to give you a little background, Moses has just received the 10 Commandments. Moses has been charged to lead the people to escape the hands of Pharaoh after 400 years of slavery. And as he leads them across the Red Sea, God commands Moses and says, Moses, my people need a law. My people need a rule to follow, an example to abide by, a standard to live up to. So let me give you this law. So he gave Moses those 10 commandments to share to the people. If you know the story, you know that this occurrence was no regular occurrence. It wasn't your regular Sunday morning service. It was something incredibly special. Because what was happening was an incredible supernatural phenomena happening on the top of Mount Sinai. On this single mountain, as Moses went up, a thick cloud began to form all around it. And God began to speak to Moses and to his people. And then this incredible, almost cinematic-like scene, God speaks. But the way that his people respond, I believe, isn't the way that we ought to respond. And so today I'd like to share with you 3 areas or 3 details that I believe we need to recognize in order to help us not live a life of excuses, but rather live a life of enlistment. Live a life that says, I'm not going to allow the things, these preconceptions or these excuses to keep me back from living the full life that God intended me to live the path and follow the direction that God intended me to live. So I'd like to share with you these 3 areas here in this study, here in this passage. Are you guys with me here this morning? You guys with me? I know it's a little later, it's 11 o'clock, and I know some of you feel like 9 a.m., 10 a.m. is kind of early in the morning, but we're here to engage with the Word of God, and I'm encouraging you to lean in because God's got something for you. God gave me this word, and I believe it's going to help you. So let's dive in, shall we? Here in Exodus chapter 20, we find, number 1, we need to recognize what is clear. In order for us to live a life of enlistment rather than a life of excuses, we need to recognize what is clear. Verse 18, look what it says here, verse number 18. All the people witnessed, all of them, every single last one of them, from the youngest to the oldest, it says, all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. Picture that for a minute. Picture that for a minute. It's like you seeing Mordor out in the distance, right? Smoking and the shaking and the trembling. It's an incredible sight. An incredible scary sight too. Look how the people responded. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. The idea there in the Hebrew is the idea of that. I don't know if you guys have experienced this before, but if you've ever gone into a cockroach-infested room or building or area, and you turn on the lights, and the floor begins to move all over the place. You know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about? Like these cockroaches just begin to scatter everywhere. That's the idea here. When they saw it, they scattered. They ran and they hid and I was about to say slithered, but ran away. And I believe the reason why was because, very frankly, they didn't want to hear what God had to say. We're going to find that here in this passage later on, but I believe that what we need to realize is understand that what is clear is that God is working. You know, if there was anyone who had a reason to say, you know what, I don't want God to speak to me. I don't want God to make me uncomfortable. I don't want God to lead me in this direction. I don't want to have to go and sacrifice or give up that. It was Moses. The same guy who was leading the people, the same guy who was stepping up to the very top of that mountain, receiving and having to speak and lead these people, Moses. And the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that the reason why many of us tend to make excuses is because we fail to realize that God is clearly working in our lives. God is clearly working. His hand, His design, His plan is woven so beautifully into your story, you just haven't realized it yet. And if you don't believe me, then let's look at the example that Moses gave. Because Moses, when we find him in the beginning of this story of Exodus, God hasn't spoken to anyone for over 400 years. There hasn't been a sermon. There hasn't been a revelation. There hasn't been anything from God in 400 years. 400 years, God has been silent. And then all of a sudden, God speaks again. And He speaks to a man named Moses. And when we find Moses, he's a fugitive of the nation that he was born in, Egypt. He's a fugitive of the law of Egypt. And he's out in the middle of the desert shepherding some sheep and goats. And he's out there and he sees a burning bush in the distance. Out of pure curiosity, Moses goes over. Right? If you saw a fire, you'd probably be like, oh, cool, what's that? So Moses goes in and he leans into that bush and he gets closer. There's no other vegetation around, and there's just this single bush there in the middle of the desert. It's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And he gets closer and closer and closer, and he hears a voice come out of it. In Exodus chapter 3, we find what that voice was. Verse 5, chapter 3, it says, He said, Do not approach here. Remove your sandals from off your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. Moreover, He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For 400 years, God has not revealed Himself to anyone. And out of nowhere, God speaks once more to Moses, telling him that God that you heard about from your dad, from your grandfather, and from all the generations before you. That's me. And I'm here to tell you something. Verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. Therefore, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, therefore, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. Moreover, I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. What was God saying there? Moses, whether you see it or not, I've been working this whole time. Though you think that I've been silent for these 400 years and I haven't cared a rip for humanity, I do care. I've been seeing it all these years. And now it's time for someone to come in and free everyone. And I've chosen you to do it. But God, if you know Moses, in the beginning of the story, Moses was a stutter. He had a speech impediment. He couldn't properly articulate and enunciate his words. And as he begins to speak back to God, he says, but God, how are they going to listen to me? I've got a slow tongue. And God says, who made the tongue? But God, why are they going to listen to me? I mean, what authority do I have? You're not going in your own authority. You're going in mine. When you go and they ask you who sent you, you say, the I am sent you. But God, what am I going to use? What tools am I going to use? You see that rod in your hand that you've been using this whole time to lead these sheep here in the middle of the desert when you felt like no one was watching you? That's what you're going to use. With that rod, you're going to open up the sea. With that rod, you're going to send fire down from heaven. With that rod, you'll bring darkness upon Egypt. With that rod, you'll control death. With that rod, you'll control nature and all of its forces. But God, excuse after excuse after excuse. If there was one guy who understood what it was like to live a life of excuses, it was Moses. But God came to him and spoke to him directly and said, Moses, stop making excuses. I'm talking to you. And Moses, in case it's not clear to you yet, I'm telling you right now, I've been working this whole time, though you have failed to see it. Now, the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been part of this church or if you've just been in this church for the last 20 minutes, then let me share something that's, if it's not clear to you yet, God is working. God is working. He is working right now in this place. And what God wants you to understand is this. God is working in me and through me. See, God doesn't just show himself just so that way you can enjoy just for yourself. He shows himself and shows you his glory and shows you his power so that he can use you to impact someone else. He doesn't just work in you, he works through you. Because it's not just about you. It's about other people as well. You might think to yourself, but Alberto, how can God ever use me? C.S. Lewis once said this, the power and will of God is so extensive that we cannot measure it, so holy we cannot evade it, and so reasonable we cannot reason with it. You might think you have every excuse in the book and you can get out of what God is calling you to do. And you might think that you can kind of dismiss that God has ever been working in your life, but you're wrong. Sorry to burst your bubble, but you're wrong. And I'm sorry if you came here expecting for someone to come and give some flowery, good, happy-go-lucky message to you, but truth is truth. And God is working in you and through you. If you don't realize that, then soon you'll realize it, one way or another. It took Moses 40 years away in a remote place where no one knew him, no one cared for him, no one knew of him, for him to finally realize, God, you've been working all along. Maybe someday God's going to have to strip you down in order for you to realize, hey, God has been clearly working all along. What is clear? God is working in me, and he's working through me. Number 2, we need to recognize what contradicts. What are the contradictions that face us as we attempt to follow God's call in our lives? I want you to see kind of the excuses or contradictions that the nation of Israel gave here in verse 19. And they said unto Moses, speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. See, they're a lot like us. No, God, no, God, you can't speak to us. No, God, save it. That's not for me. That's not for me. Yeah, giving? Yeah, not for me. Not for me, God. I'm good, thanks. I'm good. I'm just going to listen to this guy right here. He dresses nice. He sounds nice. He makes me feel good. I'm just going to listen to him or her over here. Many times we feel that way. We come to church and we feel like church is supposed to make us feel good. You speak to us, Moses, but not God. Oh, God, no, not him, lest we die. Many of us feel so uncomfortable in situations or messages kind of like this one where they're being a little personal and a little direct and unapologetic. And then when it comes into our ears, we're kind of like, nah, I'm good. I'm good. I'd rather not. I'd really rather not. And I feel if there's one guy who kind of captures this emotion, this idea that I'm trying to convey to you this morning really well, it's a Christian comedian called John Christ. There's a video here that I asked them to play. You guys can play it now.
Nick and Molly just moved to the city and can't agree on what they want. They are young and energetic and looking for a new church home. We'll take some personality tests, tour the sites, ask some questions, and based on taste, experience, and location, we'll find them the perfect congregation. I'm Corey Clark, and welcome to Church Hunters.
We're so excited to find a church. We just started dating.
With the churches we go to now, just not, like for us, just not really doing it for us, you know?
Right. I go to a satellite campus. I just find it hard to connect emotionally with a video screen. It's just...
Okay, you cry during Cake Boss. So like we've been doing a lot of services online, a lot of podcasts. There are a lot of preachers we do like.
Really good, but we want serious yet funny.
Yeah, like commanding of the stage yet relatable, you know?
We're more looking for the humor of Andy Stanley with the body of Stephen Furtick.
Hey guys,
What's happening?
I'm Corey.
Good to see you. My name's Nick. This
Hey,
is Molly.
Molly.
Hey guys, welcome to Church Hunters. This is your first church. This is Creekside First Baptist. So while it is traditional, it's still pretty current. Just this year, the pastor started untucking his shirts.
Oh, that's good.
He does dress his age though, so don't worry. He's past the Osteen suit phase, but he hasn't gone full Giglio yet.
Okay, so there's holes in the knees or no?
Well, it's frayed, but no holes.
Afraid? No. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
So hey, let me show you around. Okay,
All right,
come
let's
on.
do it.
I do love this lobby.
It's a great lobby, you know, it's not too big, not too small.
Yeah.
Should be enough room to catch up, chat with your friends.
all you need.
But here's a great thing. There's a bunch of side exits, so if you need to leave early and catch the game, you can do that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yes. Honestly, right up front, didn't love the name.
No, First Baptist. Who names a church that anymore?
Not these days. We're looking for like a
No.
Thrive Church, maybe Relevant Church, I don't know, Radiant Church, something.
This is the soundboard they use here. Now remember, it's pretty traditional here. So when Sunday comes around, they turn it way down low.
Got it. Yeah.
But the one knock on this church, they still use the childcare numbering system on the screens.
Ooh, for the
Yeah. Or as the moms like to call it, the sanctuary walk of shame.
Yeah. The Sunday morning experience was just a little too traditional
For us, I mean, the pastor's main point, 157 characters. I can't tweet that.
I really think you guys are going to love this place.
I like
We
it.
do. We like
Feels
it.
great.
Yeah.
You know, it's diverse, but it's not like too diverse, you know?
Scripture heavy sermons?
Oh,
or-
yeah.
Yeah?
What about, is it community oriented?
Absolutely.
Great.
Women in ministry?
The parking situation, you guys got to see it. It's super rare nowadays.
it.
Come with me.
It was like a maybe for when my parents
leave it
come
at a
into
maybe,
town
yeah.
for a church for Christmas, Easter type of church.
Like a holiday type
holidays.
church.
One of the main reasons that I love this church for you guys is that on your personality test, Molly, you scored high in service and hospitality.
Oh, babe.
And there's a great welcome team you could join.
Perfect.
Okay.
And then Nick, you scored really high in need for accountability.
Wow.
And the men's groups here are amazing.
You're just gonna put that out there?
Hey,
just
God
like
knows
that?
your heart, okay?
It's funny, but you know, the truth is that what that video kind of shows me is that the enemy of commitment is commodity. The enemy of commitment is commodity, guys. We don't want to commit because we want everything to fit our standard. And you know what the truth is? Many times your standards are actually higher than God's sometimes. Because God doesn't need all this flowery stuff in order for his presence to be shown, in order for him to work in your life. Can I say something else? God doesn't even need me. God doesn't need our pastor. God doesn't need our worship team for him to work here. And if you come here because you think, well, Pastor Nick is amazing or the worship is awesome, then you've missed it. Because the presence of God doesn't operate based on man. It operates based on the Holy Spirit. See, we think that, oh, the church has to be this, it has to be that. God's will, God's plan for my life needs to be this, needs to be that. Well, God, if you really want me to serve you, you're going to let me get that deal. You're going to let me find a wife. You're going to let me land that job. You're going to let me get that raise. Well, God, if you really want me to commit, then you're going to send the pastor to my front door and he's going to take me out for coffee. If you really want me to give, then God, you're going to give me like a pay raise. God, if you really want me to really get a better marriage, and you're going to make my wife submit to me. Good grief. If you really want me to go ahead and sign up for ministry, then God, you're going to make sure that you give me a great salary for ministry. Doesn't work like that all the time. And if you keep thrusting your expectations on God, thinking that God is supposed to meet every one of your expectations, then you're going to have a really rude reality check when you realize that God's expectation for your life is so much bigger, but also so much harder than expectations you have. The enemy of commitment is commodity. See, and many of us would love to live that life of ease. I said I was going to share this morning. About a year ago when we came here to LA, we came here with a specific expectation idea. I drove across the country after flying in from a mission trip in Africa and drove, honestly, with not too much money in my pocket. I slept in my car and took showers at Planet Fitness. Every stop that I could. I stopped for gas and food. I made it all the way here, not knowing where I was even going to live, but just knowing this. Pastor Nick called me back in December asking me to come to City Light to help them start a Spanish ministry. And I believe that's what he wants us to do. So I drove across the country with that expectation. But last week was the last week we had a service for our Spanish ministry. And for many people, it could be, even for myself, it was easy to think, well, I guess there's nothing for me here then. I guess God really wasn't working at all. I guess I was a total failure then, God. No, it wasn't. We saw several people saved. We saw someone get baptized. And then God worked in my own heart, in my wife's heart, and the wife of some of those that decided to sign up and serve. Allowed us to connect with families like the Ontiveros and see someone like Sam who just did parking rise to become a worship leader. See families like the Garcias give so much. And I call them out because they deserve it. They gave a ton. And frankly, the more and more I got into it, I felt like I was in over my head. But God had a different plan. Despite how great those moments were and how amazing those services, and sometimes very hard those services were, God had a different plan, and he said, Alberto, I don't want you leading the Spanish ministry anymore because I have a different plan for City Light. And God used our pastor to speak that into me. And so our hope and our goal and our dream is to someday see a church started out of this church here in a Hispanic neighborhood that isn't a church that's just about having people who could easily worship in English come and feel comfortable in their own language, but no, rather for people who couldn't worship in English if they wanted to and are coming because they're seeking something that would make them feel at home, make them feel free in a country where they might feel like they have no freedom. That's our dream and that's our goal as a church. And God made it very apparent through our pastor that we need to change some things in order to see that happen. So for that reason, my role here at City Light has changed. I'm the director of spiritual formation, so if you have a step that you want to take in terms of baptism, salvation, discipleship, or partnership in this church, I'm your guy. But let me tell you that change wasn't a change that was, to be entirely honest with you, wasn't an easy change. But it was a change God wanted. And though I had my expectation of what I was supposed to do here at City Light, God had a different expectation. And his plan and his expectation was so much greater than what I could ever have thought. And I'm thankful that I get to be part of this church and get to do what I do here at this church. Because I know his plans for me are great. They're bigger than anything I could ever possibly think or imagine. And I can make every excuse. I could say, well, God, that's not comfortable for me. I don't prefer that. I like talking to people, but I don't like having hard conversations with them. And this role means that I have to do that. God, I don't want to do that. I just want to preach in Spanish, man. Just being honest. But God had a different plan. And I had to understand that. I had to understand it because, see, the truth is that no one has ever lived a life of ease, that lived a life worth remembering. If you think that the legacy you leave behind is going to be an incredible legacy that your children and their children's children is going to remember for all of eternity, and they'll be there at your funeral thanking God for you, but all you ever chose in life was the easy way out, you're going to be sadly disappointed when you're looking on the other side of eternity and seeing the people that are there gathered at your funeral, finding it hard to find something to thank God for in terms of what you had an impact. It's the truth. You can choose to live an easy life, or you can choose to follow God and commit to His will and call. And I promise you it will be difficult. I promise you your expectations will be crushed sometimes. But the dreams and the expectations God has for you are so much greater. See, and I know that because I know that for myself, personally, I know God called us here to City Light, not just to encourage and help City Light and help our pastor and help the city of LA, but also to equip myself and my wife for the dream that we have to start a church in New York one day. And I don't apologize for that. Because as scary as it honestly feels to me many times, and how inadequate I feel many times, how comfortable it would just simply be to just stick around or find a job in ministry that paid me well, that's not God's call. At least it's not the call for my life. And if you think that every easy option has to be God, then I encourage you, look closer. Look closer. Because that easy decision just may be the enemy disguising himself as a distraction from God's bigger and greater call for your life. Jesus said, if you cannot carry your cross, you're not worthy to be called my disciple. The cross was an instrument of execution, of torment. If you think the Christian life is easy, then I'm sorry. It's not. You need to recognize what may contradict. Recognize that, hey, it's going to get scary. Hey, it's not going to be comfortable. But I promise you this, it's going to be worth it. Number 3. We need to recognize our call. In verse 20 of this chapter, Moses speaks to the people, and he says these words, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, so that the fear of him may be before you, so that you do not sin." That word test means to try or train for the ultimate purpose of growing our capacity to be better equipped for the path and adventure ahead of us. God's got a path and an adventure for you. But you know what? You need the training. You need the training. And so do I. I'm 25 years old, and I don't have much life experience. But God is doing something in my life, and God is doing something in your life, and He's getting you ready for something big. But if you're not willing to be tested, then you're not willing to follow His call. To test you, and so that His fear may be before your eyes. That word fear is the idea of reverence or respect. But I'd like to add something to that. It's to revere, respect, so we will never get over the fact that we are part of something incredible and much bigger than ourselves. That's what the fear of God is. Not just a luxury clothing brand or some old thing that preachers used to say. It's a command, it's a challenge. It's an invitation for you to say, God, you're so much bigger and so much greater than me. The sad part about this story, in verse 21, is that despite everything, look what it says. The people stood a distance away. Despite everything that God had shown them, despite everything, all the incredible things that they were seeing happening on top of this mountain, and despite hearing the words of their leaders say, hey, don't fear, for God has come to test you, and so that you would be able to revere and respect him and see that God is calling you to something greater than yourselves. Despite that, the people stood a distance in fear that they would have to face something that was incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly inconvenient, incredibly difficult. But despite how sad a phrase that is, I love what Moses does. Because while they stood a distance, Moses leaned in. Says, Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. See, that reminds me of a quote that I read once from one of my favorite authors, and he says this: we need to dream bigger than ourselves to outweigh the nightmares that appear as if they're bigger than God. And I don't know about you, but many times the things that this life is calling us to can feel like a nightmare. Our lives can get pretty dark and grim, can't it? Right? Life can get difficult. Life can get hard. But what you need to understand, church, is that many times that darkness that you're facing, actually, it's just a disguise for God's presence. It's just a disguise for his glory. Because though that darkness appeared intimidating to the people of Israel, Moses was close enough where he could see through the darkness and be able to make out the image of God and see, God, I see you there. I see you. You're right there. I see you, God. And see, if you've ever been in a pitch black dark room, at first glance, when you walk in, it gets really hard to see anything. But then your eyes begin to adjust and begin to make out some of the things that are in that room. And I promise you, if you begin to stay in that darkness long enough and keep walking through it and keep walking through it and keep walking through it, you'll understand and be able to make out the image of the one who loves you most, of the one who called you into that darkness in the first place, Jesus. And he says, son, daughter, I'm right here. Come closer. Come closer. Come closer. Come closer. I'm right here. I know it seems scary. I know it looks intimidating, but come closer. I know it looks like a nightmare what you're going through. I know it looks heavy. I know it looks hard, but I'm right here. I'm right here. Come closer. Come closer, child. Come closer. Come closer. Because what is our call? Our call is to serve and seek God, regardless of the conditions or circumstances. No matter how dark it gets. But God, I lost my job. But God, I lost my wife. But God, I lost my kids. But God, I'm still stuck in this addiction. God, I'm still struggling with the rent. God, I may have to move. God, where are we going to live? And you might feel like it's getting darker and darker and darker, and it feels more hopeless and hopeless and hopeless. But let me tell you, that's just a disguise. God is inviting you through that circumstance, through that condition, to test you, to see if you would be willing to follow him on this great and incredible adventure called Christianity and say, God, I want to follow you to the ends of the earth, no matter where it calls me to. God, if it calls me to let go of something that I hold dear to myself, then God, I'll give it up as long as I can have you. God, if it means I have to move on the other side of the country, then God, I'll do it. God, if it means I have to move to the other side of the world with my family, my children, then God, I'll do it. If it means, God, I have to step up and become a pastor or a preacher or a minister to some people, or lead or serve or give sacrificially, if I have to dip into my retirement fund to give to this church, then God, I'll do it, because I know, God, you're inviting me to something greater. You're inviting me to something deeper. You're just inviting me to know you, seek you, and serve you in greater capacities. I know it looks like a nightmare church, but it's not. It's just a disguise. It's his call. God's calling you to something. But you can choose to live one of two lives. A life of excuses or a life of enlistment. Because the interesting thing is that once you begin to make excuses, you'll find it easier to make excuses for every other thing after that. Yeah. It's going to be really easy to make excuses after that. But once you're in, you're in. And you say to yourself, no, I'm here for the long haul. Pastor's asking me to give financially and to serve and become a partner of this church. All right then, let's do it. God is calling me to make amends with my wife after verbally abusing her, or after the hurt that she caused me or he caused me. God is calling me to forgive that person after the abuse that they made me go through. God is calling me to let go of this job, to make space for something bigger and greater in my life. God is asking me to take on this role in order to influence and impact more people. I don't know what it is. Your call is your call. But you've got to go into the darkness to seek it out. You're not going to find it in the comfortable or in the easy. You're going to find it going into those dark reaches and what appears to be a nightmare, and find that his call is there. Pray with me, church.